Welcome back. This is the first video for Chapter 17, and Chapter 17 is the beginning of the last section that we're going to cover this semester in Intermediate Macroeconomics. And this is the section where we finally open up our economy to trade in goods and services and financial flows. And even we'll talk about, flows of factor markets. So, whether that is capital, labor, etc. So I think this section can be a little bit confusing, mostly because every time we talk about, a change in the exchange rate or an appreciation, depreciation, it always depends on your point of view. And so the one thing that you want to keep in mind is, which country we're talking about, because if one country's currency appreciates, the other country's currency is going to depreciate. And so we'll talk usually from a sort of home market point of view, and we'll usually talk from an American-centric point of view with dollars. But obviously, if you're, switching it, just everything switches. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So when we talk about openness, right, we're talking about trade. That can be openness in goods and services. And services is actually an increasingly important part of trade. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And the idea here is that, not everything we buy is made in the United States, right? We buy imports from around the world. We also don't sell everything we make in the United States. We sell some of the stuff we make around the world. So those are our exports. There traditionally has been limits to international trade in the form of taxes called tariffs, and also quotas, right? So a tariff is really just a tax on an import. It could be, a percentage of the value, or it could be a certain amount per unit. Whereas a quota, it says, all right, you can only bring in this much of, this good. And the idea behind tariffs and quotas, tariffs were, one of the main ways that the federal government raised revenue in the beginning of the United States of America. Now tariffs and quotas are put in mostly to protect domestic industries. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. When is it a good idea to try to protect domestic industries, and when is it sort of going to backfire and not really benefit, the economy as a whole? We can also have openness in financial markets, right? And so, we'll see some numbers in the goods market in a little bit. The financial markets are very open, right? So if you think about, we have the foreign exchange market, which is, trading different currencies. That is a huge market. But we also have foreign direct investment. So we have, investment from one country going to another country. There's a lot of foreign direct investment going to and from the United States. And some countries have put in capital controls because there is a worry if a country experiences a financial crisis of some sort, that all of the capital can leave the country, really quickly and make that financial crisis much worse. And so we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, we want to talk about openness in factor markets. So factors, remember, are the inputs that we use. So that's going to be mostly capital and labor that we're talking about. So if we think about something like NAFTA, which was the original North American Free Trade Agreement that was signed in 1993, it was sort of updated a little bit a few years ago. That allowed a lot of production to move, to sort of flow freely between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It was a lot of debate about it, whether or not it was hurt Mexico or was beneficial to Mexico. Same for the United States and Canada. Obviously, one of the biggest experiments in openness in factor markets is the Eurozone, right, in the European Union. And so with the European Union, labor is in fact free to move throughout the European Union. And I think this is one of the factors that led to Brexit, where a lot of people in Britain didn't like the sort of free movement of labor into the UK particularly. We'll see if it benefits them in the long run to get out of the European Union. So one thing that is definitely true is that we live in a very global economy these days, right? So we've done 16 chapters of a closed economy, which is not a very realistic picture for really anybody. And so you can see, you know, when we look at something like the financial crisis in this graph, is that even though it started in the advanced countries, it started in the United States and to a certain extent the UK, and you know, Europe had its own housing bubbles in countries like Spain, had other, you know, financial issues in countries like Greece. It really spread throughout the world. So the blue line is the advanced economies, probably the OECD. The red line is the emerging market and developing economies. And then the line in the middle, the yellow line, is just the entire world. And you can see that basically everybody suffered in the financial crisis to a very similar degree, because all of these economies are very connected. They're connected in terms of trade. They're connected in terms of financial markets. And so when there's a problem in one area, especially if it's a big area like the United States, it can spread very easily to the other countries. If we look at the ratio of exports and imports to GDP for the United States, we can see that they've been increasing since the end of World War II, basically, certainly since 1960. We had a sort of a period there after World War II where our exports were well ahead of our imports. Then they kind of balanced out, and now our imports have been ahead of our exports. So we've had a trade deficit, right? So countries that have more imports than exports have a trade deficit. Countries that have more exports than imports have a trade surplus. We'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about why the United States has had a consistent trade deficit over the last 40 years. But you can see that they've both been increasing, right? And so, you know, they've gone from 4 to 5% of GDP in 1960 up to, you know, between 12 and 16% of GDP currently. There have been sort of two waves of globalization in the last, I don't know, 150 years. So the first wave took place at the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. Then sort of the two world wars really decreased trade, and then it's been building up since you know, the end of the Second World War, and really has increased pretty dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years. So we'll see that you know, for the United States, this is, you know, compared to other countries, our exports and imports are fairly low. We're a very large economy. We can produce most of what we need. But, you know, if we looked at it by state, for example, then, you know, our exports and import ratio would be much higher. You know, if you look at, you know, the export and import ratio of Massachusetts, it would be quite high, for example. We also want to think about the fact that just because only sort of 15% of GDP is exports and imports for the United States, that doesn't necessarily give us a good measure of how open the U.S. economy is, right? Because we could have a lot of goods that experience competition from international producers, and so they have pressure to both, you know, keep prices low and keep improving their products. And so for the United States, one estimate is that tradable goods represent about 60% of aggregate output in the United States, and that's pretty large, right? That means that about 60% of what we produce, we could import, right? And so those producers have to worry about not only domestic competition, but also international competition. The evidence is mostly for the economy, that's generally a good thing, because it puts pressure on, you know, firms to keep prices low. I think it's definitely one of the reasons we've seen fairly low inflation over the last 20 years. And it also keeps, you know, competition to try to keep improving your products as well. If we look at the export ratio for, you know, a number of countries from 2014, you can see that the United States is on the low end, right? They were 13.5% in 2014, not that dissimilar from Japan, which was 17.7%. But the European countries are much larger, much higher export ratio, right? And a lot of that is that they're smaller, and so they're less likely to be able to produce everything they need. They also, of course, are part of the European Union. The United Kingdom was in 2014. It no longer is. It'll be interesting to see what that export ratio does in the UK. But a small country like the Netherlands, their export ratio is 83%, meaning 83% of what they produce gets exported to another country, which also means that approximately 83% of what they consume is produced in another country, right? Because exports and imports, while they don't have to be exactly the same, will be similar. And we'll talk about why that is as well. And you can see Chile, which is a medium-sized country in South America, still has quite a large export ratio of 34%. So a lot of what they're producing is being exported. Now, one thing that is important to keep in mind, GDP, remember, is one of the ways to measure GDP is value added, right? And so we don't count intermediate goods in GDP, but we do count them in exports and imports. And because we count them in exports and imports, then you can actually have an export to GDP ratio of more than 100%. And this is becoming increasingly important in a world in which supply chains are very international, right? So if you think about, something like the iPhone that gets designed in California, it's going to have parts that come from the United States, from Japan, from Korea, from China, that might get assembled in Taiwan and then brought back to the United States. It's always important to keep that in mind when we're looking at exports and imports now, right? It's not just final goods that get exported and imported anymore. And so, they give the example here in the book that in 2014, the export ratio for Singapore, which is a very small city state, was 188%. And that's not too surprising for a country of that size. So we're going to continue our discussion here in chapter 17, and then in chapter 18, we'll talk about the goods market specifically, and adding exports and imports to our IS curve.